Purdy Peacock, the Blizzards. Purdy Peacock lived on a beautiful farm with lots of flowering bushes, fruit trees, and a large garden. Purdy loved his life on his farm, and he enjoyed spending time relaxing under a few bushes and watching his friends and family. He enjoyed watching the cats frolic and play. The dog always amused Purdy, and he enjoyed watching the dog run around his beautiful farm. He also loved watching his peacock friends and family show off their long, colorful, and gorgeous feathers. What a beautiful sight to see! Fall was approaching, and Purdy and his family and friends had spent a lot of time harvesting their vegetables from the garden and fruit from their trees. The potatoes were dug and placed in the root cellar for them to eat during the long, cold winter season. On October 10th, Purdy and his family and friends looked out of their beautiful golden barn. To their amazement, it was snowing, and it continued to snow all day long. When the snow stopped falling, they had received 6 inches of snow. The weather remained cold for the next few weeks until it warmed up a little in November. The snow began to melt, and Purdy would walk down the melting paths to their golden barn. In December the weather turned colder, and on the 8th day there was a snowstorm that left the ground of Purdy's beautiful farm a sea of white. They had received 20 inches of snow, and all that could be seen was white snow everywhere on Purdy's farm. Purdy and his family huddled in their golden barn and entertained themselves by watching the cats and the dog run around and amuse themselves. Christmas was approaching, and on December 23rd the temperature had reached 32 degrees, the freezing point of water. It also began to rain, and the rain froze on the trees and buildings on Purdy's farm. On Christmas Eve the freezing rain began to turn to snow. Purdy's family from the other end of the state had planned to celebrate Christmas Eve with them, but decided the weather forecast did not look very good and would wait until the weather looked better to make the long trip to Purdy's farm. Christmas Eve was an anxious and scary time for Purdy and his family. The lights would go out every hour for 15 minutes at a time. They would carry a flashlight with them wherever they went. It was a frightening Christmas Eve. Would there be power? Would the power come back on? Purdy was very concerned. If the power went out, what would they do to keep warm? What a stressful Christmas Eve they had. The heavy ice on the tree limbs was causing the limbs to break. Purdy and his family heard the scary and frightening sounds of cracking and breaking tree limbs. They would look out of their golden barn and listen to the cracking sounds and watch the tree limbs fall out of the tall trees onto the ground with a huge crash. Very scary indeed. The weather kept getting worse and worse, and by Christmas Day there was a major blizzard, and Purdy and his family were snowed in. Nothing was able to travel down the road to Purdy's farm because there were huge snowdrifts blocking the roadway. Purdy telephoned his neighbor a mile away to see how the roads were there, and he was told the snowdrifts were up to 15 feet tall and much taller than his tractor. Purdy's farm was no longer a pretty shade of green, but was nothing but white. White everywhere. The snowdrifts on Purdy's farm were worse than Purdy had ever seen in his life. He had never seen so much snow, and had never seen snowdrifts so tall before. There was nothing that Purdy could do but wait for someone to dig through the snowdrifts on the road to his farm. Nobody, absolutely nobody, could travel on the road to his house. Purdy and his family were stranded. His nieces from the other end of the state telephoned every day to see if they could come celebrate Christmas with them. Purdy sadly said, "We're still snowed in. Nobody can travel on our road because of the huge snowdrifts." Purdy's nieces were disappointed and sad, and so was Purdy and his family. Christmas Eve was always a fun time at his house, with the family enjoying a meal and opening Christmas gifts. It was always so much fun. But this year was a sad one for Purdy and his family. The nieces' family did not have the blizzard or ice storm, and they were beginning to think that Purdy and his family just did not want to have them come for Christmas Eve. Of course, that was certainly not the case. The days went by, and with each day Purdy anxiously awaited the sound of the snowplow. Day 1, on December 23rd, the ice storm began, and Purdy was iced in. Day 2, Christmas Eve, December 24th, and Purdy was iced in. Day 3, Christmas Day, December 25th, and Purdy was snowed in. Day 4, December 26th, and Purdy was still snowed in. During all of this time the lights and power would go off and on, sometimes for hours at a time. It would get very cold, and Purdy and his family would huddle together to keep warm. When the power finally came on, they would all shout for joy, they were so happy. Purdy was getting very concerned and started making telephone calls to let people know that he was snowed in with no way out of his farm because of snowdrifts were blocking his road. He called a national news station and told them about the weather conditions and how the ice was breaking tree limbs and how the power would go off and on, and that he was afraid they might freeze to death. Later that evening a radio station called and interviewed Purdy about his dangerous, life-threatening situation. Later, Purdy received a telephone call from his sister in New Jersey. His sister said that she was in the car driving to a store when a news story came over the radio about a blizzard in Iowa. His sister could not believe it when she heard Purdy tell his story over the radio thousands of miles away. She was so surprised. On December 27th, day number 5 of being snowed and iced in, Purdy received a phone call, and the news people wanted to know if they could see Purdy's house from the highway. The highway was open for travel, but Purdy's country road was still closed shut by the high snowdrifts. Purdy told them yes. The news crew traveled the highway and telephoned Purdy. Purdy and his family walked to the road on the huge snowdrifts and spoke with the news crew by telephone about a half-mile away. Purdy used binoculars and could see the people down the road. It was such a relief to actually see someone after 5 days. They were told the interview would be on television later that day. It was fun to watch, but Purdy wanted his road to be opened and plowed. Purdy had been in contact with local personnel responsible for county roads. Late afternoon on December 28th, the 6th day of being snowed and iced in, Purdy called to see how the county snowplows were progressing. He was told that all country roads had been opened. Purdy was shocked. He said, "I'm still snowed in. There's not been a snowplow by my place." About an hour later, a snowplow appeared and made a small, single path down the road, and Purdy was no longer snowed in. "Finally!" Purdy exclaimed. Purdy called his family at the other end of the state, and they were thrilled. Purdy's nieces decided they would come the next evening to finally celebrate Christmas on December 29th. Talk about a Christmas to remember. Purdy's nieces arrived, and the first thing they did was jump in the snowdrifts. Then they had something to eat and proceeded to open the gifts they had waited for so long. They all had a fun time, and it was so nice that their company could finally come and enjoy Christmas with them, even if it was 6 days later than it should have been. The next day the nieces played in the deep snow, went sleigh riding, and they even made a hole in the big snowdrift by Purdy's front door and pretended it was a fort. They had so much fun. At the end of the day, his nieces had to go back home to the other end of the state. But they were all so happy that they had finally been able to celebrate with Purdy and his family, and Purdy and his family was very happy too. It was December 30th when his nieces left for home. The rest of the winter was still ahead, and a winter to remember it was. In a few days there was another ice storm. The ice built up on the heavy snow on the tree limbs, and once again trees and branches were making that eerie cracking sound, breaking and falling to the ground. One morning Purdy and his family woke up to the now familiar sounds of tree limbs falling all around his beautiful farm. All of a sudden the lights went out, and there was no power. Purdy looked out of his golden barn and noticed that there was a power line down on his property. The power line had broken under the weight of the heavy ice and was now laying on the ground. Purdy telephoned the power people. Later that day the power people came out, and it was fixed. The freezing rain then turned to snow, and it again got very windy, and once again there was another blizzard with another 20 inches of snow. Again Purdy was snowed and iced in. The snow piled up, and the drifts got taller and taller. Once again nobody was able to travel down the road to Purdy's farm. As if that wasn't enough, the lights went out again, and there was no power. Purdy looked around his farm to see if there were any broken tree limbs on any power lines, or if any power lines had broken on his property again, but there was nothing. So Purdy decided to look down the road to check on the power lines. Using his binoculars, he could see the power line on his road was laying over other power lines and on the ground. He again called the power people, but this time they were not able to come because the snowdrifts on Purdy's road were too deep. Later that day the snowplow went by, and the power people came out and put the power line up. Purdy and his family screamed with delight when the lights came back on. They were hoping that this winter would end sometime soon. Such was not the case. While this was the last time that Purdy was snowed in for 2 days or more, there continued to be more blizzards and drifted roads. There had been 5 blizzards and 2 ice storms in 7 weeks. Wow, that was hard to believe. Purdy had never seen anything like it before. Purdy and his family dealt with the remaining storms as well as they could. They also hoped that they would never, ever see another winter like this one. Purdy decided to take a nap and hoped that when he woke up he'd find out that this winter was nothing but a bad dream. Purdy began dreaming about the blizzards.